Hello, everyone. My name is Patrick Donnelly. I'm a research scientist with the Intermountain West Joint Venture located here in Missoula, Montana. And I'm here today to share with you a series of studies we've been conducting looking at the long-term trends and resiliency of wetlands and arid landscapes and their importance to migratory water birds in Western North America. When we think about conservation of these types of systems, we're often challenged. Um, we think about how we invest and prioritize in wetlands, and we think of things like triage in conservation. And this is a paper from Bautrill in 2008, where she lays out, the concept of smart decision making and how we prioritize places that we expect to have a large biological return from those investments. And in the past, what we've often done with wetlands is invest in landscapes that have a large wetland footprint and have a documented um, occurrence of a large population of migratory water birds. So we went to the places that had the biggest wetland footprint with the most birds. And this has been a successful strategy as a whole, but what it may lack is our understanding and importance of those systems, maybe that are more isolated, particularly in arid systems where birds don't have the same choices they do in places that have a higher abundance of water. And so when you're transecting and migrating across a very arid system, a very small isolated wetland may have an equal value to a wetland that's occurring in a larger landscape with more water and more wetlands in it. And so understanding these relationships and how these effects of climate change and changes of human water use have impacted the resiliency, particularly of these isolated arid systems, becomes very important in changing the paradigm in our investment strategies to assure long-term population sustainability into the coming decades. And in 2020, we began a process of systematically looking and examining some of these long-term wetland trends and processes in arid systems. What we did is look at a series of closed basin watersheds. So these are watersheds that have a terminal lake in them, as well as a bunch of other wetlands that occur upstream from that. And we evaluated what those trends were both in wetlands and that terminal lake over time. And the distribution of these wetlands were part of a broader flyway or pathway these birds use to migrate. And so, and understanding how different latitudinal gradients may be affecting the availability of wetlands, we focused on the Great Basin and then in Mexico to examine what these trends might be. And in Nevada, these systems included the Ruby Valley, the Humboldt Sink and the Humboldt watershed, the Carson Sink and Carson watershed, as well as Walker Lake and the Walker watershed. What we found is that we expected to see those lakes receding at a pretty rapid rate. That's something that's been fairly well documented over time. But we anticipated perhaps that the wetland systems that occurred within that watershed would act as a buffer and had, say, a higher rate of resiliency relative to that shrinking rate of lake surface water area that we saw. But in fact, what we found was the opposite, where we still saw that decline in surface water and lakes, but those wetlands that occurred upstream from those sites were actually decreasing at twice the rate. What we mean by decreasing is the surface water in those lakes is going away. So the wetland still remains, but what's happening is it's not getting wet as often or staying wet as long. And that is simply a reduction overall in habitat availability and wetland resiliency that's occurring across the Great Basin as a whole. We took a second step with that same philosophy, but this time, instead of examining these closed basin watersheds, we tied long-term wetland trends to an individual species, in this case, greater sandhill cranes. And in panel B, what we see is the migratory pathways of greater sandhill cranes that breed in western Idaho and northeast Nevada, and winter in the Salton Sea and along the lower Colorado River Valley. These are birds that are marked with GPS transmitters, and we track them using satellites to determine those important stopover sites those birds utilize from Duck Valley to the north, down through the Marys River, White River valleys, Pahranagat Valley, and kind of create a string of pearls of wetland habitats that are small and isolated, but were very important in supporting migration as these birds move between both breeding and wintering sites. What we found was among those sites, About half those sites are experiencing in the past decade significant wetland declines, likely due to changes in climate and land use practices that are driving availability of surface water and affecting wetland availability and habitat conditions these birds experience. If we take another step with another species and examine a similar kind of context or similar um, long-term trend in wetland availability, in this case, we're looking at white-faced ibis. This is a student-led project. Shay Coons here at the University of Montana Wildlife Program is leading this study as part of her master's work. And what Shay is doing is taking all the known white-faced ibis colonies across the Intermountain West, and she's buffering those colonies by about 18 kilometers, or the foraging radius or distance from those colonies, and then measuring land use practices and change that's going on over time. And of the 29 colonies inside of Nevada that she's documented, 21 of those sites are experiencing wetland loss or wetland drying. 13 of those sites, almost half, are experiencing significant wetland declines over time. So again, different species, a little bit different timing and availability of wetland resources, but the same result. We're seeing a significant drying across the state, which could be influencing, in this case, a breeding population of white-faced ibis, which for the past 2 to 3 decades has been a priority species for management for NDOW. Now, when we think about conservation and measuring wetland loss, the Fish and Wildlife Service has done a tremendous job in outlining what loss means across the U.S. But what loss really means to them might be a little bit different than what we think of relative to loss in places like Nevada and arid systems. What loss is to the Fish and Wildlife Service and these wetland trends and status reports is a physical loss of a wetlands. For example, if you managed or measured a wetland in year 1 and came back in year 3 and there was a parking lot there, that was a physical wetland loss. What they don't account for actually is change in process. And so we call that as functional loss. And if we look at a change or a map of change in wetlands across the West, here we show in green areas that are experiencing physical wetland loss. Outside of a small area in California, the rest of the Western US has experienced no physical loss or very little physical loss. But that doesn't mean we're experiencing a tremendous amount of functional loss, and that's lack of water to keep those wetlands wet, which can just in the same way result in a loss of habitat and result in impacts to species and populations over time and space. Now, we talk about Nevada in the context of wetland isolation and the importance of these small wetland sites. We have another student-led project here where we looked at cinnamon teal. And cinnamon teal are an arid land adapted species that you can see here by these tracks or migration routes with these little yellow dots, which represent stopover sites these birds utilize. When those birds fly from the north to the south, in this case, from breeding grounds down to wintering grounds in Mexico, they rely on small wetland sites for stopovers during that migration. And what we found was as aridity increases, as birds go from the northern part of Nevada down to the southern part of Nevada, they're actually utilizing smaller and more isolated wetland systems. And that's a really important thing to understand, because when we talk about our long-term paradigm of investing in these really big, robust landscapes that have a lot of wetlands in them, we're omitting these very small places, which in arid landscapes become really, really important for these birds as a stepping stone to cross from important breeding grounds down to their important southern wintering grounds. And by ignoring those, particularly in cases where we're seeing lots of wetland loss, we could be omitting a very important portion of our wetland conservation need within Western North America, particularly in Nevada. And when we talk about wetlands and measuring wetlands, I like to throw this slide into the deck here. And what it is, this is an example of the models we use along with our bird movement data. The models, I say, when I say models, I mean wetland models. And we can see here on the right-hand side, this is an example of the Walker River and Walker Reservoir. And these black dots represent individual locations of teal utilizing that system. And the blue represents surface water conditions at the time that bird is actually utilizing that habitat. The darker colors represent deeper, more open water. These lighter colored blues represents shallow or turbid water or water that's interspersed with emergent vegetation. The same slide on the left-hand side shows the distribution of teal again, but in this case, you're seeing three different colors from blue to green to pink. Those represent semi-permanent blue, seasonal wetlands in green, and pink represents temporary systems. So in this case, we're really measuring hydrology or hydro period. So I say semi-permanent, that means those systems are wet most every year. Green means are seasonal, they're there, but they typically dry up by the end of the summer, and temporaries again are those places that are pink, which are only wet for a couple months of the year. This is really important to understand how systems respond to drought and how birds utilize different systems for habitat types based on underlying hydrology. We can also measure systems that are very small. This is an example again from the teal study where we can see up here a cluster of black dots representing a teal location on the ground. And these little blue clusters here represent stock tanks where we have an earthen dam and they're actually backing up a small pool of water. These are very important systems that birds utilize across the West, including in Nevada. These are also characteristic of many of those small spring systems that Nevada is so famous for. And our model is really, really good at picking out these small areas and highlighting their importance to migratory water birds because they're utilized so heavily in these very arid systems. This is just another quick shot to show you what that background Google image looks like with those same blue stock tanks highlighted from our model showing there's water there and bird use over time and space. So in closing, what I'd like to really talk about relative to short-term needs is understanding that we're seeing this rapid decline in surface water availability and the need for these isolated systems to support migration through landscapes. Increasing the awareness of the accelerated loss of these arid land ecosystems should be a priority in the short term. Communicating to our wildlife agencies, our land management agencies, and NGOs to develop strategies around how this information and science can be leveraged to actually build upon a conservation message to give us a better footing to stand on to argue that these systems are important enough to conserve and guide resources towards. We can leverage that science we just talked about, especially in continental waterbird populations, and really break through that older paradigm of bigger, better, more is always our conservation priority, when in fact, these small isolated systems in places like Nevada might be our greatest priority. Long-term, taking all this information and using it to really inform and change that paradigm will be key. I think of things like the North American Wetland Conservation Act. Changing the priority footprint for some of these resources will be critical in bringing more outside dollars into these systems to really get those dollars where they need to be to offset these long-term changes we see in climate and also urban water demands and agricultural water demands, which are competing for those same resources that wildlife rely on across the state. I know we're going to have a panel discussion that's going to follow this slide. So I hope to see you guys on their side to elaborate on some more of these concepts and answer your questions. And again, I want to thank everybody for their time and their attention, and we'll see you on their side. Thank you.